A lost wallet, an unexpected friendship, a legacy that changes everything. Elijah Moore, a 14-year-old with big dreams and even bigger obstacles, stumbles upon a wallet on his way home from school. It's filled with enough cash to solve his problems and fund his school trip, an opportunity he thought was out of reach. But Elijah can't shake the values his mother instilled in him. So, he returns the wallet to its owner, Mr. Carlisle Whitfield, the town's wealthiest and most reclusive man. What begins as a simple act of honesty opens the door to an unlikely friendship. Mr. Whitfield, lonely and distant after the loss of his wife and estrangement from his children, sees a spark in Elijah. In a gesture of gratitude, Mr. Whitfield offers to fund Elijah's education, a gift that changes everything for the boy and his single mother. But when Mr. Whitfield unexpectedly dies, his estranged daughter returns to town, determined to reclaim what she believes is rightfully hers. Accusations fly, and Elijah is thrust into a battle that could shatter his future. As secrets from Mr. Whitfield's past come to light, Elijah discovers that his connection with the old man was more profound than he ever realized. In a world where trust is fragile and doing the right thing comes at a high cost, Elijah must navigate a treacherous path, one that could destroy everything he's worked for. The Last Promise is a heart-wrenching story about moral choices, family legacies, and the powerful bond between a boy and the man who gave him hope. Elijah Moore jogged down the cracked sidewalk, his backpack bouncing against his back. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. His part-time job at the newspaper office waited just a few blocks away, and he was cutting it close as always. His mind was buzzing, not with thoughts of the job itself, but of the school trip to the state capital, just a few weeks away. It was a chance to leave his small town, to visit museums, government buildings, and universities, places he could only dream about. But it wasn't cheap. He tugged the strap of his worn backpack, the one that carried his dreams, books, and sometimes his worries. His mom, Janelle, worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, but the extra money for the trip? That was on Elijah. He was determined to save every penny from every paper he delivered to make the trip happen. "I've just got to make it," he muttered, quickening his pace. The thought of letting his mom down, after everything she'd done for him, gnawed at him. He needed to contribute, to do his part. When Elijah stepped into the newspaper office, the familiar hum of activity greeted him. Mrs. Thompson, the receptionist, waved from behind the counter, her warm smile a comforting sight. "Hey there, Elijah. Got your route all ready." "Nothing special today, just the usual," she said, sliding over a bundle of newspapers. Elijah nodded and picked up the stack. "Thanks, Mrs. Thompson. I'll be back soon." The paper route was simple, almost mindless, but it gave him time to think. As he made his way down the quiet streets, tossing newspapers onto porches and doorsteps, he couldn't help but think of his mom. Janelle had always worked hard, and despite their struggles, she never lost her smile or her belief in doing the right thing. Elijah admired her more than anyone, and he felt the weight of wanting to live up to the values she had instilled in him. By the time he finished his last delivery, the sun had begun to set, bathing the town in a soft, golden light. Elijah wiped the sweat from his brow, feeling the familiar ache in his arms. The day's work was done, and he was one step closer to his goal. On his way back to the newspaper office to clock out, Elijah slowed his pace, his thoughts still on the upcoming trip. His gaze drifted to the ground, and that's when he saw it, a wallet lying there on the sidewalk. It wasn't just any wallet. It was thick, thicker than any wallet Elijah had ever seen. His heart thudded in his chest as he bent down to pick it up. He glanced around quickly, but the street was empty. No one else seemed to have noticed. Opening the wallet, Elijah's breath caught. It was filled with crisp bills, more money than he had ever held in his hands. His fingers trembled as he thumbed through it. This was enough to cover the entire cost of the school trip. More than enough. For a moment, the temptation gripped him. He could keep it. No one would know. The money could solve his problems, make his dream trip a reality, and even help his mom. But then, Elijah's mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Do the right thing, no matter how hard it is." He snapped the wallet shut, feeling a wave of guilt wash over him. He knew what he had to do, even though part of him didn't want to. The walk to Oak Street, where the wallet's owner lived, was longer than Elijah remembered. He had checked the ID inside the wallet, Carlisle Whitfield, an older man who lived in the largest house in town. The stories Elijah had heard about Mr. Whitfield made his stomach churn with anxiety. People said he was cold, distant, and rude to anyone who dared approach him. Still, Elijah knew he couldn't keep the money. As much as he wanted to, it wasn't right. He shoved the wallet deeper into his backpack, his mind racing as he rehearsed what he'd say when he arrived at the house. "I found your wallet, Mr. Whitfield." "No big deal," he muttered to himself, but the words felt clumsy in his mouth. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter might be more complicated than he thought. As he rounded the corner, the imposing figure of the Whitfield mansion loomed ahead. The mansion sat like a relic from another time, its grand, ivy-covered walls casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. Elijah stood at the bottom of the stone steps, staring up at the house. He felt small, insignificant, and out of place. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, the weight of the wallet suddenly feeling much heavier. He raised his hand to knock, hesitating for a second. Then, with a deep breath, he rapped on the door. Silence. For a moment, Elijah thought maybe no one would answer. Maybe he could leave the wallet at the door and slip away unnoticed. But just as he was about to turn and leave, the door creaked open. Carlisle Whitfield stood in the doorway, a tall, thin man with sharp blue eyes that seemed to cut right through Elijah. His expression was stern, his brow furrowed with suspicion. "Yes? What do you want?" His voice was cold, distant, just like the rumors suggested. Elijah swallowed hard, clutching the wallet in his hands. I found your wallet, sir. I thought I should return it." For a moment, Mr. Whitfield didn't move. His gaze shifted from Elijah's face to the wallet and back again. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it from Elijah's hands. He opened it, flipping through the contents, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up at Elijah, his voice softening ever so slightly. "You returned it." Elijah nodded, unsure of what else to say. Mr. Whitfield stared at him for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Thank you." With that, he closed the door, leaving Elijah standing alone on the front step, unsure of what had just happened. As Elijah walked away, his heart still pounding, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever hear from Mr. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, watching his mother, Janelle, prepare dinner. The smell of seasoned chicken filled the small room, and the warm glow of the evening sun shone through the window. Elijah took a deep breath, still processing the events of the day. "Mom, you won't believe what happened today," he began, pushing his fork around his plate. Janelle turned from the stove, her dark curls tied back as always, her tired eyes widening slightly in concern. "What is it, baby?" "I found a wallet." "On my way home from the paper route," Elijah said, excitement mixing with anxiety. He knew the decision he'd made was right, but he still wanted her reassurance. Janelle turned fully now, crossing her arms, waiting for him to continue. "It had so much money in it, like more than I've ever seen. I could have paid for the whole trip to the state capitol. Maybe even more," Elijah explained, his voice low. "But I didn't keep it. I returned it to the owner. You know, that old man, Mr. Whitfield? The one who lives in the big mansion on Oak Street." Janelle's face softened with pride. "You did the right thing, Elijah," she said, her voice warm. She walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's what your father would have done. I'm proud of you." Elijah smiled, his heart lightened. His mother's approval meant everything to him, but there was still a lingering uncertainty. The man had seemed so cold, and Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he had intruded where he wasn't wanted. The next day, Janelle was cleaning up the kitchen when she heard a firm knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. A police officer stood on the porch, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the officer said. "I'm Officer Rivera. I'm here to speak with Elijah Moore. Is he home?" Janelle's stomach twisted with worry. "Elijah's still at school." "What's this about, officer? Is everything okay?" "I just need to ask him a few questions about an incident that occurred yesterday," Officer Rivera replied. "It's nothing to be alarmed about, ma'am." But Janelle couldn't help but feel a rising sense of dread. Why would the police need to talk to Elijah? Did something happen with Mr. Whitfield after he returned the wallet? Later that afternoon, Elijah returned from school to find his mother sitting at the table, her hands clasped in front of her, worry etched across her face. "Mom, what's wrong?" Elijah asked, dropping his backpack by the door. Janelle looked up, her expression hesitant. "A police officer came by today. He said he needed to talk to you about something that happened yesterday." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean? Did something happen with Mr. Whitfield's wallet?" "I don't know, Elijah," Janelle said, her voice soft but tense. "But they're coming back to talk to you soon. I'm sure it's nothing, but well, it's just strange." Elijah's mind raced. What if Mr. Whitfield thought he'd stolen something? What if there was something missing from the wallet, and he was being blamed? A few hours later, a knock echoed through the house. Elijah opened the door to find Officer Rivera standing there once more, but this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Mr. Whitfield, his tall frame slightly hunched, his expression guarded. "Good evening, Elijah," Officer Rivera said, nodding to Janelle, who stood behind her son, her hands resting protectively on his shoulders. "This is Mr. Carlisle Whitfield. He's the man whose wallet you found." Mr. Whitfield stepped forward, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Elijah. "Thank you for returning my wallet, boy," Mr. Whitfield said, his voice gruff, but lacking the cold suspicion Elijah had expected. "I had no way of finding your address, so Officer Rivera was kind enough to assist." Elijah blinked in surprise. "You're welcome, sir. I couldn't keep it." Mr. Whitfield nodded slowly, something flickering in his eyes that Elijah couldn't quite read. "I didn't expect that kind of honesty. Most people these days would have taken the money and run." "Not my son," Janelle interjected, her voice firm but warm. "We've always believed in doing the right thing, no matter how tempting the wrong choice might be." For a moment, Mr. Whitfield looked at Janelle, then back to Elijah. There was a weight in his gaze, as if he was reassessing something deep inside himself. The conversation took an unexpected turn as Mr. Whitfield cleared his throat and looked directly at Elijah. "I've been thinking about your honesty," Mr. Whitfield began, his voice quieter now. "And I want to do something for you. I've got more money than I need at my age, and I know what it's like to grow up without many opportunities. I want to set up a scholarship for you, boy. It'll cover your education, through college, if that's where you want to go." Elijah's eyes widened in shock, and Janelle gasped audibly. "Mr. Whitfield, that's too generous," Janelle stammered. But Mr. Whitfield waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense. It's not about the money. It's about helping a young man with potential. You returned something valuable to me. The least I can do is help you reach your potential." Elijah stood there, speechless, his heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. He glanced at his mother, who looked just as stunned. This offer was more than they had ever dreamed of. Janelle placed a hand on Elijah's arm, her voice full of emotion. "Elijah, what do you think?" I don't know what to say," Elijah finally whispered, looking up at Mr. Whitfield, who was still watching him with that same intense gaze. "Thank you. Thank you so much." And in that moment, Elijah's world shifted. What had begun as a simple act of honesty was now the beginning of something far bigger than he could have imagined. As Mr. Whitfield nodded and turned to leave, Elijah couldn't help but wonder what this new chapter of his life would hold. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the modest neighborhood, Elijah returned home from his long day. The front door creaked as he stepped inside, greeted by the familiar aroma of his mother's cooking. His mother, Janelle, stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, her tired face lighting up when she saw Elijah. "How was your day, honey?" she asked with a warm smile. Elijah hesitated for a moment, then decided to share the day's most unusual event. "I found a wallet on the street," he said, sitting at the kitchen table. "It had a lot of money in it." Janelle's stirring paused for a second. "What did you do?" "I returned it," Elijah replied. "It belonged to Mr. Whitfield. You know, the old guy with the big house on Oak Street. I gave it back to him." Janelle smiled, pride filling her eyes. "That's my boy. You did the right thing." Elijah nodded, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The encounter had left him with a strange feeling, like something had shifted in his world, though he wasn't sure what it was yet. The next morning started like any other. Elijah left for school, while Janelle headed to her shift at the diner. But later that afternoon, while Elijah was still at school, there was an unexpected knock at the door. Janelle, just home from work, opened it cautiously. A tall police officer stood on the porch, his face serious but not unfriendly. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the officer greeted her. "Is this the residence of Elijah Moore?" Janelle's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, it is. Is something wrong?" "I need to speak with him about something that happened yesterday," the officer said. Janelle's mind raced. "He's at school right now. What's this about?" The officer didn't offer much detail, only mentioning that it concerned Mr. Whitfield. Janelle's worry deepened. She assured the officer that Elijah would be home soon and watched him walk back to his patrol car, a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. When Elijah returned home from school, the tension in the air was palpable. Janelle sat him down at the kitchen table, her face lined with concern. "The police came by today," she said softly. Elijah's eyes widened. "The police? Why?" "They said they needed to talk to you about something to do with Mr. Whitfield," Janelle explained, her voice steady but anxious. Elijah's mind raced. Had something gone wrong? Did Mr. Whitfield think he had taken something from the wallet? The knot in his stomach tightened. He had done the right thing. He was sure of it. But doubt crept in, gnawing at the edges of his conscience. "I don't understand," Elijah muttered. "I just returned the wallet." Janelle reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on his. "I'm sure it's nothing. You did the right thing, Elijah. We'll get this sorted out." But Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. Later that evening, just as the sun began to set, there was another knock at the door. This time, when Janelle answered, she was met by the same police officer, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was Mr. Whitfield, dressed in a crisp suit, his cane in hand. His presence was as commanding as it was surprising. "Mr. Whitfield?" Janelle asked, stepping aside to let them in. Mr. Whitfield nodded curtly, his gaze shifting from Janelle to Elijah, who had appeared from the living room, his eyes wide with confusion. "I came to thank you properly, Elijah," Mr. Whitfield said, his voice gravelly but sincere. "I realized I hadn't done that yesterday. The officer here helped me find your home." Elijah blinked in surprise, the tension in his chest loosening slightly. "You didn't have to come all the way here," he mumbled, still not sure what to make of this unexpected visit. "I did," Mr. Whitfield insisted. "What you did, it wasn't just about returning a wallet. You showed honesty and integrity. That's rare these days." The officer nodded in agreement, though he remained silent, observing the exchange with a small smile. Before anyone could respond, Mr. Whitfield took a deep breath and looked directly at Elijah. "I've been thinking about how I can properly show my gratitude, and I've come to a decision." Janelle and Elijah exchanged confused glances. "I want to set up a scholarship fund for you," Mr. Whitfield continued, his voice strong despite the weight of his words, "to ensure you can attend college without worrying about the cost." Elijah's jaw dropped. "A scholarship? For me?" Mr. Whitfield nodded. "Yes. You remind me of someone I once knew. Someone with potential, with a drive to do better in life. I want to help you reach that potential." Janelle's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. That's incredibly generous, Mr. Whitfield. We don't know what to say." "Just say you'll consider it," Mr. Whitfield replied. "We can work out the details later." Elijah stood in stunned silence, his mind racing. The scholarship was a dream come true, but it came out of nowhere. He had never expected such an offer. And yet, as he looked at Mr. Whitfield's weathered face, he could see the sincerity in his eyes. This was more than just a thank you. This was the beginning of something new, something that would change Elijah's life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As Mr. Whitfield and the officer left, Elijah and his mother stood in the doorway, their hearts full of disbelief and gratitude. Elijah's world had just shifted in a way he could never have anticipated. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Everything was about to change. Elijah stood at the gates of the prestigious new high school, his heart thudding in his chest. His uniform felt stiff, the building too grand. As he entered the bustling halls, he noticed the way his classmates moved with confidence, their casual discussions of weekend trips and expensive gadgets making him feel like an outsider. The academic pressure weighed heavily on him, too. Teachers assumed he had the same resources as the other students, private tutors, study groups, but he had none of that. After his first week, his once perfect grades started slipping, and he feared disappointing both his mother and Mr. Whitfield. Cause: the scholarship has opened doors for Elijah, but with it comes challenges he hadn't expected. Effect: Elijah begins to feel out of place, setting the stage for the emotional conflicts that follow. Elijah sat at Mr. Whitfield's kitchen table, a stack of textbooks in front of him, his head in his hands. "I don't know how to keep up," he confessed, his voice heavy with frustration. Mr. Whitfield, seated across from him, sipped his tea, his sharp blue eyes observing the boy. "You're smart, Elijah. But more than that, you've got grit," Mr. Whitfield said, his voice gruff but warm. "You'll find your way. Just don't forget, what makes you different from them isn't a weakness. It's your strength." Elijah nodded, grateful for the old man's wisdom, but still unsure if he could really live up to the expectations placed on him. Cause: Elijah's struggles at school lead him to seek advice from Mr. Whitfield. Effect: their relationship deepens as Mr. Whitfield becomes a source of wisdom and comfort for Elijah. Back at home, things were no easier. Janelle, his mother, was exhausted from working double shifts. Elijah noticed how tired she looked when she came home, her shoulders slumped and her smile thin. They barely had time to talk like they used to, and Elijah felt a creeping guilt. While he had this scholarship and new opportunities, his mother was still scraping by to keep their modest life together. She had sacrificed so much, and yet here he was, taking so much from Mr. Whitfield. "Mom, do you need help with bills this month?" Elijah asked one night. Janelle shook her head, offering a tired smile. "Don't worry about me, Elijah. Just focus on school. That's the best way you can help." Cause: Janelle's ongoing financial struggle forces Elijah to confront his growing discomfort with receiving help from Mr. Whitfield. Effect: the tension between Elijah's gratitude and guilt starts to build, pushing him to question the balance in his life. It wasn't long before Janelle voiced her concern. One evening, as Elijah prepared to head out to Mr. Whitfield's for their regular visit, Janelle stopped him at the door. "You're spending an awful lot of time with that man," she said, a worried crease forming between her brows. Elijah frowned. "Mr. Whitfield's helping me, Mom. He's teaching me things." Janelle sighed. "I'm glad he's helping you, but don't forget where you come from. Don't forget your family." The words stung, more than Elijah expected. He wanted to tell her that he hadn't forgotten anything, but the truth was he had been so wrapped up in Mr. Whitfield's world that he had started to lose touch with his own. Cause: Elijah's time with Mr. Whitfield begins to cause tension with his mother, who feels left behind. Effect: Elijah's internal conflict between his loyalty to Mr. Whitfield and his responsibility to his mother intensifies. Later that night, Elijah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him. He wanted to make his mother proud, to take the opportunities Mr. Whitfield had given him, but it was all becoming too much. He realized that he couldn't keep everyone happy. Not his mother, not Mr. Whitfield, not even himself. He had to take control of his life, find balance, and stop trying to live up to what everyone else expected of him. Elijah resolved to find a way to bridge the gap between his family's needs and the path Mr. Whitfield was helping him walk. Cause: the growing tension between his commitments forces Elijah to reconsider his priorities and how to navigate his relationships. Effect: this resolution sets up the next chapter, where Elijah will confront these conflicting loyalties and make decisions that will shape his future. This chapter builds the emotional complexity of Elijah's journey, bringing the tension between his new opportunities and his family's struggles to the forefront, and setting up key conflicts for the next chapter. The day begins like any other, but Elijah's peaceful routine is shattered when Mr. Whitfield's daughter, Clara, arrives unannounced at the mansion. Clara is sharp, cold, and immediately suspicious of Elijah's relationship with her father. She hasn't been in touch with Mr. Whitfield for years and is surprised to find someone like Elijah, a stranger to her, so involved in her father's life. Cause: Mr. Whitfield's growing relationship with Elijah has piqued Clara's curiosity, especially when she learns about her father's generous scholarship offer. Effect: Clara's presence begins to undermine the trust and bond Elijah has built with Mr. Whitfield, as her accusations cast doubt over his intentions. During her visit, Clara confronts Elijah and Mr. Whitfield. She accuses Elijah of taking advantage of her father's vulnerable state, insinuating that he's only befriended him for money. Clara's words sting, especially as she airs her grievances about how her father neglected her and her brother after their mother passed away. The confrontation leaves Elijah feeling confused and defensive, while Mr. Whitfield grows distant, hurt by his daughter's accusations. Cause: Clara's resentment toward her father overflows as she sees Elijah taking the place in Mr. Whitfield's life that she believes should have been hers. Effect: Elijah begins to doubt whether he truly belongs in Mr. Whitfield's life, leading to internal conflict and deepening tension with Clara. Later, Elijah returns home, emotionally shaken. He talks to his mother, Janelle, about what happened with Clara. Although Janelle reassures him, Elijah can't help but question everything. Did Mr. Whitfield offer him the scholarship because he saw potential, or was it out of pity? Was Clara right to accuse him of exploiting the old man's generosity? Elijah is torn between his sense of loyalty to Mr. Whitfield and the weight of Clara's harsh words. Cause: Clara's confrontation introduces a seed of doubt in Elijah's mind about the legitimacy of his bond with Mr. Whitfield. Effect: Elijah's inner turmoil grows, threatening his confidence and trust in the relationship he's built with Mr. Whitfield. Clara returns the next day with a legal representative. She demands that Elijah and his mother stay away from her father, warning them of legal action if Elijah doesn't sever ties. Mr. Whitfield, frail and overwhelmed, doesn't intervene, leaving Elijah feeling abandoned. Clara claims her father's memory is fading, and she accuses Elijah of manipulating him into making the scholarship offer. Cause: Clara's suspicion and mistrust push her to escalate the situation with threats of legal action. Effect: Elijah is forced to confront the possibility that everything he's built with Mr. Whitfield might collapse, and he's left questioning whether he should continue fighting for their friendship. Heartbroken, Elijah has to make a decision: continue standing by Mr. Whitfield's side, risking legal trouble and further strain on his family, or walk away from the relationship altogether. Elijah returns to the mansion for one last conversation with Mr. Whitfield, who, despite his weakened state, reassures Elijah that their friendship is real, regardless of Clara's accusations. Mr. Whitfield expresses regret over his estranged relationship with his daughter, but he refuses to let her destroy the bond he's formed with Elijah. Cause: Elijah's growing sense of doubt and Clara's threats force him to consider stepping away from Mr. Whitfield's life. Effect: Elijah chooses to remain loyal to Mr. Whitfield, setting the stage for a confrontation with Clara and a legal battle over the scholarship and inheritance. This chapter sets the stage for the final confrontation and the emotional climax of the story, where Elijah must navigate both his loyalty to Mr. Whitfield and the looming threat of Clara's interference.